What's up, Tailgaters? My name is Tailgate Nate. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be giving you my 2020 Big 12 preseason power rankings. So the Big 12 is a conference last year that got a playoff team in Oklahoma. They ended up making the playoff last year in a conference that overall had some surprising teams. Kansas was better than most people expected. Of course, Baylor had a shot at the playoff appearance if they could have beat Oklahoma, and then there were lots of teams that kind of disappointed in the Big 12 last year. And the Big 12 overall is a conference that I feel like is going to ultimately improve from where they were last year this year. But I don't know how much I like their chances to make the college football playoff this year. It's just going to be really competitive this year, and the conference champion could easily have 2 losses this year. So before we get into the power rankings, you're going to see a list of stats that I've compiled for these teams. And it's going to be their stats from last year. So on the offensive side, it's on the left-hand of your screen. You're going to get points per game, yards per game, rushing yards per game, passing yards per game, and their overall offensive returning production, which will be a percentage number. And then their opponent, and then the flip-flop stats on defense. So their opponent points per game, opponent yards per game, opponent rushing yards per game, opponent passing yards per game, and their overall defensive returning production. Again, it's another percentage number. The returning production stats, basically, it's just whatever percentage of the stats compiled last season is returning. It takes all stats into consideration and all that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the Big 12 power rankings. All right, so number 10 for me, or aka the worst team in the Big 12, is the Kansas Jayhawks. And you look at their stats last year, they weren't all that great in one of the highest scoring conferences in college football, only averaged around 23.5 points per game, and meanwhile gave up 36 points per game. Kansas got some good athletes and won their first non-conference game in so many years just last season. And overall, I feel like Kansas is going to be a team that's going to continue to improve. But I still feel like we got to give Les Miles a couple more years before Kansas really can take that next step and get back to competing in the Big 12 and making some bowl games. Kansas is not even returning all that much on offense and defense, only 41% on offense and 44% on defense. They're one of the worst in the nation in overall returning production, and it was really obvious to me why the Kansas Jayhawks are at number 10. All right, number 9, I got the West Virginia Mountaineers. So they are bringing in the 4th best recruiting class in the Big 12, which surprised me. I did not know that their recruiting class was that high. But I'm not really expecting this team to do a whole lot this year. You look at their offensive stats last year, they were not that great. Their passing attack was pretty okay, about 250 passing yards per game. That's pretty solid, actually. But they struggled to score the football. They struggled to gain yards on the ground, and that's really what hurt this West Virginia team last year. They are returning 71% of their offense, which is good for West Virginia. It means they're going to have some experience there. But overall, it's also the defense that worries me for West Virginia. 28 points per game last year, almost 400 yards per game allowed. That's only 6th in the Big 12, but 400 yards per game allowed is not great by any means, and only returning 58%. So their defense is going to have a lot of struggles next year. And overall, people are circling that first game of the season against Florida State and thinking that maybe they can be competitive in this game. I don't see how they can be competitive in the game against Florida State. I'm just not all that high in this team. I don't think they're going to do anything special next year, and that's why they're at number 9. All right, number 8 is the Texas Tech Red Raiders. So Texas Tech hopefully is going to be returning their quarterback, Alan Bowman. He just has been battling injuries throughout his entire career. And even without Alan Bowman, with Max Duffy, they had the best passing attack in the Big 12, with almost 325 yards per game, which is absolutely insane. 300-plus yards through the years, and say let alone 325, just get that extra step. They scored the football pretty well, around 30 points per game. Yards, they were 2nd in the Big 12 with 474 yards per game. But the defense for Texas Tech last year was absolutely awful. 30 0.3 points per game allowed, 480 yards allowed. Now, it's impressive enough to get around 475 yards per game. But then when you allow 480 yards per game and you're the same team, it's just absolutely crazy. They're returning 71% of their defense, which means they're going to have some good experience, and hopefully Texas Tech is able to do good, but they're only returning 48% of their offense, and Alan Bowman not going to have the weapons that Max Duffy did last year. So I believe that if Alan Bowman can stay healthy, Texas Tech can be a very, very Texas Tech can surprise a lot of teams if Alan Bowman can stay healthy. But until Alan Bowman proves to me that he can stay healthy and Texas Tech just finds more weapons to use, they're going to stay at number 8, and their defense improves. And until their defense can improve, they're at number 8. All right, number 7, I have the Kansas State Wildcats. So last year, their defense was pretty solid, one of the better ones in the Big 12, only 21 points per game, only around 370 yards per game allowed. Passing attack was one of the better ones in the Big 12, only allowing about 200 yards per game. Now, their offense could score the football, averaged around 30 points per game, which is only 8th in the Big 12, but the Big 12 is a high offense conference, but they just struggled to get yards. They would get good field position, and they would capitalize off turnovers, but the yards per game were not that great compared to the Big 12, only around 360 yards per game, which was second to last in the Big 12, and only returning 59% of their offense. So you might be wondering why Kansas State is at number 7. Well, a big reason Kansas State is this high is because of Skylar Thompson. Skylar Thompson's coming back, and I feel like he's pretty underrated. No, I don't feel like he's going to be one of the better quarterbacks in college football this year, but he is still a very underrated quarterback, and I feel like Skylar Thompson can do some big things if we just give him the chances to. But the passing attack has got to improve for Kansas State. And overall, they got to replace the guys that they're missing on defense. And until I see that they can do that, they're going to stay at number 7. At number 6, I have the TCU Horned Frogs. So Gary Patterson's Horned Frogs are not going to be going anywhere this year. Their defense, of course, as usual, one of the better ones in the Big 12. They struggled a little bit more in the scoring department on defense than they usually did, but still only allowed around 26 points per game, under 350 yards per game, 337 yards per game allowed, which was first in the Big 12. They were also first in their passing defense and didn't even allow 200 yards through the air. And they are returning 68% of their defense, which is only 6th in the Big 12, but TCU's defense is usually really, really good. And I don't think TCU's defense is going to have too big of problems next year. But the problem for TCU, for me, is their offense. They scored around 30 points per game last year. They gained around 410 yards per game last year. Their rushing attack was pretty good with 204 yards, but their passing attack has got to improve, only around the same as the rushing. Usually expect your passing numbers to be higher than your rushing numbers, and they're only returning 61% of that offense, which means they're going to have some slots that they need to fill. Of course, they're going to have to find a guy to replace Jalen Reagor, the first-round draft pick at wide receiver. They're going to have to find someone to replace him, and until they can replace Jalen Reagor, and I know their defense is going to play like I know TCU's defense can play, they're going to stay at number 6. So it does help that they do bring in the 3rd best recruiting class in the Big 12. 5th is the Baylor Bears. Now, this may surprise a fair few of you, but Baylor has the worst recruiting ranking in the Big 12 this year, which is I never thought Baylor would have the worst recruiting rank in the Big 12 this year. I just absolutely never thought. Baylor was the surprise team in the Big 12 last year, and their defense was one of the best in the Big 12. You look under 20 points per game, which by far and away is first in the Big 12, only around 360 yards per game. Rushing defense around 142 yards per game allowed, and passing offense only about 217 passing yards per game allowed. So their defense was one of the better ones in the Big 12 last year, but they are losing so much production on defense. They're only returning 32% of their defensive production, which is one of the worst in the entire nation and absolutely dead last in the Big 12. So Baylor's defense is going to have to – the players are going to have to play better, but they are bringing in Dave Aranda as head coach, who was an old defensive coordinator at LSU. So Baylor's going to have a very defensive-minded team next year. And you look at what they did on offense, they were pretty good, around 33.5 points per game, 420 yards per game. And they're returning 70% of their offense. What that number doesn't show you is that they're not returning Denzel Mims, their number one target. But Charlie Brewer is coming back. And if Charlie Brewer can find another guy like Denzel Mims that he really trusts and he can just put the ball out there and trust this guy to make the catch, Baylor could be a dangerous team next year, especially if the defense plays like they did last year. But until I see that the overall returning production, or I should say the lack of returning production, doesn't hurt Baylor that much, they're going to stay at number 5. Number 4, I have the Iowa State Cyclones, 6th best recruiting class in the Big 12. It was a fairly okay recruiting class that went into the transfer portal a lot, tried to get some good recruits come in, fighting with teams like Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Iowa State. Able to get some pretty okay recruits, but no really notable ones that stand out to you. Their offense and defense, they were pretty average in the Big 12 last year. The only thing that I feel like Iowa State needs to improve on is they got to give the ball to Breece Hall more. I've been talking about it a lot. I feel like Breece Hall just has the potential to be a 1,000-yard rusher, but he hasn't been able to show it because Iowa State does not run the football as much as they do now. Yes, they have a great quarterback in Brock Purdy who can throw for 300 yards per game, as you see there, but overall, Iowa State's just got to run the football more. I feel like if Iowa State can run the football more, they're going to be a much better team. And their defense is overall pretty solid, only around 26 points per game, under 400 yards per game, and under 140 yards per game on the ground. And they are returning 73% of that. So they're going to have a lot of experience back on defense. But until I can see that Iowa State really trusts Breece Hall to run the football, because I think he's a very underrated running back, and I feel like he has potential to be really good. But until Iowa State can prove that to me, they're going to sit here at number 4. Number 3 is the Texas Longhorns. They are bringing in the best recruiting class in the Big 12, and last year they were fairly decent. When you look, I feel like Texas really did have 2 halves of the season. When you look at the first half and you watch the game against LSU, it was actually a really competitive game. And then when you look at the back half of their season, it was not that great. Texas did not perform well in the back half of the season. It was definitely 2 different teams. I encourage you to go back, watch the Texas and LSU game, knowing what we know now that LSU is, again, the national champion. Texas gave LSU one of the better games this year. But I feel like Texas just overall has to improve tenfold everywhere. Their offense was pretty good at scoring and stuff like that, but only 66% of their offense is coming back. But that does include Sam Ehlinger, and they are getting a transfer wide receiver from Michigan and Tariq Black. So to replace guys like Devin Duvernay and guys who have left, Texas is going to be able to replace those wide receivers fairly quickly, I would imagine, but their defense worries me a lot. They were not that great on defense last year, 27 points per game, 431 yards per game, and their passing their passing defense almost gave up 300 yards per game, which is second to last in the Big 12, but they are returning 82% of their defensive production, so they're going to have a lot of experience, and maybe those experienced players can learn from their past mistakes and be able to boost this Texas defense to a whole new level. But until I can see that Texas defense does improve, they're going to stay at number 3. But I feel like 3 is a very good spot for the Texas Longhorns. Number 2, I have the Oklahoma State Cowboys. 5th recruiting ranking in the Big 12, so an okay recruiting class, but I am really high on this team. They are 9th nationally in returning production. They're bringing some recruits that maybe could help them fill the few holes that they have. But overall, when you look, one of the best rushing attacks in the Big 12, highlighted by Chuba Hubbard and L.D. Brown. So it makes sense why they have one of the better rushing attacks in all of college football, and I should say all of the Big 12. Yards per game, they can get yards. They can score the football, but their defense has just got to improve. They're giving up too many points. They're allowing too many yards, especially yards through the air with 253 passing yards per game. Just too much. They are returning 86% of their defense, which is first in the Big 12, and as I mentioned, already returning a lot on the offensive side with Juba Hubbard, LD Brown, Spencer Sanders, Tyron Wallace. But their defense is returning a lot too, and a lot of experience is going to be coming back for the Oklahoma State Cowboys. And I am really high on this Oklahoma State team. I think that they can beat some of the better teams in the Big 12 this year. But until I can see that the experience on Oklahoma State's offense, or excuse me, on their defense plays at a new level, they're going to stay here at number 2, and it's really hard to beat the team that's at number 1 right now, because the number 1 team in the Big 12 is the Oklahoma Sooners, and I think you all saw this coming. They're bringing the second best recruiting class in all of the Big 12, but when you look all around, just a really solid team. You look at what they did last year: first in points per game, first in yards per game, first in rushing yards per game in the Big 12, third in passing yards per game with almost 300 yards per game. Of course, that was highlighted by Jalen Hurts and Trey Sermon, but both of those guys are going to – and CeeDee Lamb, my apologies. But all 3 of those guys are going to be gone. Jalen Hurts went to the NFL, CeeDee Lamb went to the NFL, and Trey Sermon has transferred to Ohio State. So they're going to have to fill those holes pretty quickly. But Spencer Rattler is a young quarterback who has a lot of promising potential, and we all know that Lincoln Riley is the quarterback whisperer. He can get quarterbacks into shape really, really quickly. And because of those 3 guys leaving, only 49% of their offense is returning. Offensive line has got some questions too. Their defense was pretty good last year as well. You look best rushing defense in the Big 12 last year, but they're losing their 2 best defenders, and that includes the linebacker Kenneth Murray. He is not going to be there anymore. So Oklahoma has got a lot of spots to fill, but they definitely have the talent to be able to do it. And I feel like Oklahoma is the team in the Big 12 that is just consistently dominant in this conference. And in my opinion, they have the best shot to make the college football playoff for the Big 12 this year. And I mean, who else but Oklahoma at number 1? They've been consistently dominant in the Big 12 and just consistently great in the Big 12. They've been making college football playoff appearances for several years, and maybe they can get back to a college football playoff this year. And I'm really excited to watch how Spencer Rattler and the Oklahoma system gets figured out this year, and it's why Oklahoma's at number 1. That's going to do it for my 2020 Big 12 preseason power rankings. If you guys enjoyed, please leave a like. Also consider subscribing if you're brand new to the channel or just enjoy my content. And if you haven't done so already, please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Big 12 this year. Do you think the Big 12 is going to get a conference or a team in the playoff? Let me know. And as always, until next time, remember, play hard, but tailgate harder. I'll see y'all in the next video. Goodbye.